Hello and welcome. My name is John Forster. I'm pleased to be with you today to present Research Snapshot number 15 for PRACE, Professionals and Researchers in Early Childhood Intervention. I am speaking from the lands of the Wurundjeri people. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present today. The paper that I'm discussing today is called How is Inclusion Defined in Early Childhood Level in China, Germany, and the UK? A systematic literature review by Dr. Rothe and her colleagues. Many countries have now ratified the United Nations Conventions on Persons with Disabilities. This contains a commitment to inclusion. However, countries are interpreting this commitment in different ways. This paper makes an important contribution to understanding the components that contribute to the inclusion of children with disabilities. What you need to know: this article arises out of a concern that there is a lack of clarity in how inclusion is being interpreted. This leads to confusion both about how to operationalize the concept and how to study it in a consistent way. The research question was, how is inclusion in the early childhood context in China, Germany, and the UK defined? The article explores how inclusion in early childhood is defined and implemented. It does this by using a framework of access, acceptance, participation, and achievement. These aspects are compared across countries. What is this research about? The article starts by discussing the different translations or concepts for the term inclusion within the 3 countries. There are actually 7 countries if you consider the separate countries of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland within the United Kingdom. All the countries approach inclusion based on their social history and particularly their concerns about social cohesion. To identify the similarities and differences in approaches to inclusion, the authors use the 4-dimensional framework: access, acceptance, participation, and achievement. The experience of inclusion in the 3 countries are identified through a review of the relevant literature. In the discussion, the authors also observe other factors limiting inclusion. This includes tokenism, where preoccupations about who should be eligible for support limits who benefits. To address this, they call for a rights-based, principled approach. What did the researchers do? The researchers undertook a systematic review of the literature covering the years 2000 to 2020, using a search of electronic databases with keywords including inclusion, early childhood settings, kindergartens, early childcare, childcare diversity, difference, access, acceptance, participation, and achievement. They identified relevant studies from China, Germany, and the UK. They included only empirical studies that discussed the concept of inclusion in early childhood education, and studies relevant to the countries. They excluded papers not published in peer-reviewed journals or which did not address perceptions or definitions of inclusion. After this process, 15 papers met all these requirements. They were then coded to identify what the papers reported about the experiences of access, acceptance, participation, and achievement. What did the researchers find? Often the findings did not apply equally to all countries studied. Regarding access, children's access was categorized into 4 areas: physical environments, activities within program design, curriculum and assessment, qualified professionals. Limited access to activities and programs was frequently reported. In China and UK, limited access to curriculum and assessment was reported. In the UK, a lack of access to qualified professionals was reported. The question of acceptance raised interesting results, including that children with special education needs and those from immigrant backgrounds were often not fully accepted. In some settings, children with disabilities were more readily accepted than immigrant children, with physical appearance and mother language making acceptance more difficult. Acceptance in early childhood programs was also influenced by the type of support the child needed. In some situations, children were accepted for particular reasons, for example, support for speech development. Children's acceptance could also be impacted by the severity of their condition. Acceptance provides a focus on who is eligible for inclusion and who does inclusion apply to. The participation dimension. In China and Germany, a lack of children's participation in classroom activities, instruction, and play was observed. While parental participation was considered valuable, parents were largely excluded from decision-making and social participation. The acceptance dimension. The studies on China and the UK had a focus on academic achievement and did not explore in depth children's social and emotional development. Conclusions. Overall, the review identified that the definitions of inclusion were often narrow. There was an emphasis on individual deficiencies rather than broader contextual or systematic factors. The concept of inclusion was frequently linked to disability and had preconditions for participations. The authors are interested in how they can further explore and expand on this research to help build a framework for comparing developments across countries. I had the opportunity to briefly chat with Dr. Rothe, the principal author of this article, about the findings of the study. Ask if you can tell us about how you got to the framework and what came out of your research about it.
So we ask ourselves what are the most important elements to define inclusive education, and what is inclusive education in practice for us are, because three of us, apart from being researchers in the university, we are also very much involved with practice. I myself has also been in 2 years in an inclusive school working as teachers, and the other two colleagues as well. So for us to enable inclusion to take place in practice is really important. It's very essential for us for the definition, and that's why we think that a definition that represents true participation and true achievement is very key to define inclusive education. Inclusive education is not only let the kids physically being there, and there should be acceptance from the kids, their peers, their teachers, and the parents, but also real participation and learning, achieving. And so that's a second level of why we come into this definition. And then the third level is why do we also want to involve different stakeholders' perspective on it? So we do not only want to look at the children's perspective, like, how do they understand disability, and how do they accept peers with various disabilities, and how are they learning and participating, which is important. But we also want to know what the parents of the students, how are they feeling, whether they feel accepted, and whether they feel they are participating in the school, in the daycare, in the early childhood centers, being it called in different cultural contexts. So we think that's also very important to involve the parents into the dialogue. And we are actually also aiming for other stakeholders, for example, teachers and special educators, and also school leaders. So we want to have this very comprehensive perspective to be involved in the whole definition. Because those are the people who are actually in daily practice, who are really implementing and living in inclusive practice if they are willing and also able to do it. So that's why we come up with this framework to involve all those different perspectives, but and also to be targeting at those 4 key aspects of accepting and of accessing, accepting, and participating and achieving. So that's a little bit of the background to come up with this framework. Yeah.
And what were the main things you found when you used those to compare the different countries?
Yeah. I think the main findings were surprising in a way, but also not surprising. There were a lot of similarities we identified across the 3 cultural contexts. For example, the very rare voices from the kids. Like very few studies are focusing on the voice of the kids, which we consider is actually really, really important to make inclusion happen, but very few research from the 3 cultural contexts specifically targeting at children. So children's voice is lacking in this definition process. But at the same time, we also find like differences, for example, very drastic differences influenced by the social cultural factors. For example, in the Chinese context, the definition is mainly, when we talk about inclusive education, the definition is there's an immediate response, almost like a reflex, that it's connected to children with disabilities. So there's this very much special education orientation towards the definition of inclusive education. And surprisingly, we were thinking before the research that Germany is also kind of following the same path. But surprisingly, due to the past 2 decades of policy development and policy advocacy, as well as a large number of research projects promoting inclusive education, and from those literature we identified, there's actually a new development of definition of inclusive education in a German context, which is to include, for example, the inclusion of children with migrant family, IMMI and migrant family, and also refugee background family. So we see this a little bit broader definition of inclusive education taking place in a German context. So this is like the first thing that come to my mind. But the third thing, we also find out that a common thing across the 3 countries is that these 4 dimensions are not equally addressed when we talk about inclusive education. So the access is across the 3 countries, you can see the access is very obvious, is very much recognized, is very dominating, and you can see that progress due to policy development, due to the UN Convention, because the 3 countries all signed. So by law, you can see a lot of kids have access to general schools, but there are various results for the other 3 dimensions, for example, acceptance and participation and achieving. Yeah. Maybe one thing to mention, which I think could be also interesting for the Australian context, or just generally universally interesting, is that for the achievement dimension, the academic or the cognitive achievement for the children with or without disabilities is very dominating compared to the social emotional achievement, which could probably be very universal phenomenon. I think, of course, considering the different ages of the children entering the daycare program in the 3 countries, but I would say this very early on cognitive or achieving cognitive academic performance is already very obvious, or very much emphasized across the 3 cultural contexts. I mean, especially from Chinese perspective, but I think it will also be quite relevant for many other countries. So that could be actually quite interesting to make a link with this early on cognitive achievement already starts. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, actually, Australia is
Yeah.
still very play-based
Yeah,
in terms of the
that's
early
good.
years. So I think we are less I think we kind of we're in tussle. We're always tussling in terms of
That's
are we
good.
are we focusing on the social emotional development, or are we
Yeah.
um, going to go into writing and arithmetic and
Yeah.
those things?
Yeah. 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 Yeah, I think it's actually quite interesting to also just reflect it a little bit in terms of this play-based learning, or just like this kind of constant struggle between social, emotional, and cognitive development. I mean, of course, countries also change, depends also on like which party is in power, and there are also like different policies advocating different emphasizes of development. But what we find also from this framework is there's has been also some very interesting like development of the definition of inclusive education within different country, even though we have a comparative perspective, but we also show like within each individual country or cultural context, there's this trend of developing from a very much only focusing on one dimension or two dimensions to more moving to more and more dimensions. So that's a very good sign, I think. And also there's also this trend of only focusing on children with specific types of disability to all types of disability, and then to more broader dimension of diversity. For example, to include children from LGBTQI group, or from migrants and immigrants family, or refugee backgrounds, or other cultural backgrounds. So you can see there's a trend of going to a more broad and more diverse direction. Yeah.
How can you use this research? This article is interesting for anyone trying to understand inclusion and its interpretations and variations. The framework is relevant at an individual level, as well as across systems and countries. In Australia, we have strong discussions about access and participation, but are less focused on acceptance and achievement. Looking across countries, experience is very complex at the moment. This limits what we can learn from each other. I had the opportunity to work on a paper comparing inclusion in early childhood education across Australia, Greece, and Malaysia. We found it difficult to find commonalities beyond the uncertainty of the implementation of new approaches and the slow process of workforce development. This article offers a valuable framework for such comparisons in the future. On a positive note, Australia does recognise the importance of a broad principled understanding of inclusion. The Commonwealth Inclusion Support Program identifies children with a range of additional needs, including disabilities, and children from a range of backgrounds, including First Nations children, as requiring inclusion supports. Having such a national program is also an achievement. However, as the Productivity Commission recently observed, most of the inclusion support program resources go to children with disabilities to fund untrained staff members, which raises important questions about access to professional staff. Where to from here? If you're interested in this area of work, I have included some Australian resources which may be of interest. There is a joint statement on inclusion developed by Early Childhood Australia and Early Childhood Intervention Australia, developing common direction between the two fields. Dr. Coral Kemp's article provides a history of the development of the inclusion of children with disabilities in Australia. And the article on Australia, Greece, and Malaysia I mentioned is also included. About the researchers are connected through European special education networks, particularly in Germany. They each have expertise in one of the countries that was the focus of this research. Dr. Rantan has experience in China, but has also worked in Germany. She is now based in the Netherlands at the University of Groningen. Dr. Chandrika Devarakonda teaches about diversity, equity, and inclusion at the University of Chester in the United Kingdom. Professor Antje Rothe teaches inclusive education and primary education at the Catholic University of Applied Social Sciences in Berlin. Finally, here is the citation for the article if you would like to read it in full. There will also be a link to it on the website. Thank you for listening. If you've not already done so, please join up on our newsletter.